Ziegler with me. This is Get Rominger on the phone. John, for people who don't know you, you've spent about the last 10 years investigating the Jerry Sandusky case. Uh, Obviously, I have some history with the case as well. I'm sure we're going to get into that tonight. Uh, Before we get started, I want to let people know you've got a podcast out called With the Benefit of Hindsight. And we're going to talk a bit about that because I think that's where you've really put a lot of work and time and effort uh, into finding out what happened. You're calling it, or at least the description I have that is out there on Apple, is the true story of corruption, greed, and self-interest that destroyed Penn State, its iconic coach Joe Paterno, and an alleged monster. This series follows nearly 10 years of investigation of this case conducted by journalist John Ziegler. So what got you started on that?
Well, first of all, Karl, thanks for having me. I have to say, of all the, over 100 interviews I've done, at least on this case, this one is the most unusual. You are doing this interview, and you've been somebody who I have viewed as almost a mythical figure over the last, much of the last 10 years, having been the co-counsel for Jerry Sandusky's defense. And, we finally spoke on the phone rather extensively a few weeks ago, and it was great to finally get a chance to talk to you. And you had some very interesting insights about your experiences, and hopefully I have some interesting stories about my experiences, and we can kind of team up on this. And I know behind the scenes, we've already talked a little bit about teaming up on all this. The short story of how I got involved in this is that when this story broke nationally, and as you know, it broke locally before it broke nationally, but when it broke nationally in November of 2011, I was a documentary filmmaker of some reputable note, especially in conservative circles. My previous two films had successful, one of which had debuted on the Today Show in a high-profile newsmaking interview with Matt Lauer. That was about the 2008 presidential election called Media Malpractice, how Obama got elected. It featured the most extensive and exclusive interview Sarah Palin ever did about the 2008 election, which I did from her home. Blew up the world when that happened, much to my surprise. And I did all of the major television shows, including The View and the Today Show and all the cable news network shows. And so I was looking for another project. I wasn't sure which direction I was going to go. And I saw this explosion in State College, Pennsylvania. And I had grown up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which, as you know, is nowhere near State College. It's basically in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And so I grew up knowing who Joe Paterno was and knowing who Jerry Sandusky was. But I was not a huge Penn State fan. I was a Notre Dame fan. I grew up as a Catholic kid. And Notre Dame was my favorite team. The only Penn State I ever went to was Temple Penn State at the old Vet Stadium, and I was rooting for Temple. So, I was not a Penn State fan. But
John, let me stop you for
10 years ago.
Let me stop you for a second, because before you go a little bit further, some of my audience might not know how extensive your media experience is. And I did a little cheat sheet here, so I'm just, I'm going to shoot your accolades for a second. You were actually considered one of the top 100 talkers in the country in talk radio. When the Atlantic wanted to do kind of a hit piece maybe, or a story about talk radio, they actually sought out and did a piece about you to give the greater context of talk radio. Now, I've read the piece. I think it's fair in some respects. It obviously has a slant. It was written, with a particular way. But if you really read it, they really kind of compliment you as a top performer when it came to radio, someone who, can really hold a thought in his head, can put a coherent argument together, and was really popular with the audience. And you were nationally syndicated, but you were also big in LA, and that's a big media market. People here on the East Coast, I don't think always appreciate how unique a media market that is. So it's not like you were some guy out there, floating around looking for something to do. Like you said, you had the documentary film experience, but you were also a top radio guy, right? I mean, that's fair to say.
Well, I've done a lot of things very in a very mediocre fashion in my career, Karl. I've had a lot of spectacular successes and a lot of spectacular failures. The Atlantic, then known as the Atlantic Monthly article you reference, is one of the more bizarre episodes in a very, very strange career. It's far more bizarre than you even gave it credit for. First of all, it was written by David Foster Wallace. David Foster Wallace, in liberal circles, is almost a godlike figure. He is considered the voice of his generation. This was cemented basically when he killed himself not long after the article about me came out. Not that I was the reason he killed himself, but that article ended up as a 23-page cover story in Atlantic Monthly magazine. 23 pages. And it was very strangely written. There are at least 3 factual inaccuracies in the first paragraph of the article. I did not know who David Foster Wallace. I'm embarrassed to say this, but when he came to me and wrote me a letter asking to shadow me, I did not know who David Foster Wallace was. And this was really before Google became, ubiquitous. I didn't even think to look him up. I thought if he's wanting to shadow me, he can't be that big of a deal because I'm not a big deal. I had just moved to Los Angeles to work at KFI. And when I met him, I thought there's no way this guy's a big deal. He seemed like a homeless person. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. He seemed and smelled and looked like a homeless person. And this is the guy who millions of people considered to be the genius of his generation. I spent months with him, or he spent months with me, and there was not one moment in those many months that he spent shadowing me that I ever thought, boy, that guy's smart. Boy, that guy really knows what he's doing. There was nothing. I pride myself on seeing talent in others. I think that's my greatest talent, actually, is being able to see talent in others. I never saw any talent in this guy at all. And so
he saw talent in you and actually said that part of your talent was playing the straight mediocre guy in the LA market, right? But I found it fascinating because I read that article and I thought, this tells me something. You, John Ziegler, were important in the talk radio industry in some respect because you represented the prototype of the Rush Limbaugh type. Now, we just had a local guy, Ken Matthews, who went national, and he only lasted 7 months because apparently he accidentally said some things on a live mic. He did Rush's last show. But when I think of Ken Matthews, and then I read this, I think you were the Ken Matthews of that time.
Raising a lot of issues. But
right?
I don't know. Here's my theory on what happened with the David Wallace. Here's my theory on the David Foster Wallace essay. Okay. I think he was intending to do a hit piece on talk radio and thought that he originally tried to go after Limbaugh, but Limbaugh wouldn't let him shadow him. So he thought, okay, if I can't go for the big dog, I'm going to go for a guy who's more likely to let me do this. I live in Los Angeles area. KFI is the #1 talk station in the country at the time. This is the new guy in town. Maybe he'll let me do this. And he'll be so naive. I'm going to be able to do this hit piece on him, and it's going to be awesome. But something interesting happened on the way to the hit piece. And that is, I think he actually liked me. I think he actually was surprised. I think he was that he liked me. 2, that I do so much research. See, I'm not, this is partially why I'm not in talk radio anymore. I'm not a normal talk radio guy. I took it very seriously. I took it very much as a news program with my opinion. Man, I was ultra prepared. In fact, if my older me was talking younger me, my #1 piece of advice probably would have been, don't prepare so much. You're wasting a lot of time and energy, which ends up costing you in other ways. And so I think he was shocked by that, because I think the liberal view of talk radio, which, by the way, sometimes is correct, is that some loudmouth who knows nothing just gets in front of a microphone, spews some BS opinions and says, let's take some calls. Tell me how great I am. That wasn't my shtick. My shtick was, I didn't have a shtick. I was actually all about finding out what the truth was. And by the way, that didn't help my career either, because what talk radio wasn't as much then, but it certainly is now. Talk radio now is really all about telling the choir what they want to hear. Preaching to the choir, telling a cult, providing therapy, I call it, for a cult.
Yeah.
That's what talk radio is. And I just don't do that. I am a, follow the story where it goes. I don't care. I don't care what people think about me. I don't care if people like me. I don't care if people hate me. It doesn't matter to me. I have asbestos skin. And that's getting back to the Penn State Sandusky case. Karl, I don't believe in fate. I really don't.
Right.
But I have said many times that if there was fate, the first 45 years of my life built me for the Penn State Paterno Sandusky case. I mean, the growing up in Pennsylvania, but not in state college, the going to college at Georgetown, the coaching high school football in New Jersey and in California, having been a sportscaster in television and radio, knowing every element of the news media, being a documentary filmmaker, and seeing how the news media can take narratives and spin them for their own purposes, and how there's no going back. Not to mention, even some other details that are probably worth even getting into. It's almost eerie how my life prepared me for
John,
this, for better or for worse. Because as you know better almost anybody, this.
Right. You started in sportscasting. I think, was that one of your first media jobs?
Yes, my first on-air job was a TV sporter in just outside of Pittsburgh, in Steubenville, Ohio, Wheeling, West Virginia. The NBA there. Ironically enough, my news, and I was the weekend sports guy, weekday reporter. My weekend news anchor was Liz Habib, who ends up being my co-host 30 years later, plus on With the Benefit of Hindsight. He was a Pitt grad, and she was somebody who I wanted to have host, because she believed everything. Paterno Sandusky case. She reported it all. And I knew, because I knew her, and I knew, she had enough respect for me, that I could convince her. And I wanted her to come along for the ride. I wanted her to be the audience, being skeptical about, wait a minute, hold on. You're telling me this? You're telling me that didn't really happen? You're telling me this really did happen? And eventually I succeeded. And you can actually hear that. You can hear one of the more interesting elements of With the Benefit of Hindsight is you can hear the evolution of Liz's thought process on this. And it's quite dramatic.
And so she's kind of like what your Scully to your Mulder. You're the true believer, and she kind of. Maybe we're dating ourselves since we know that reference, but that kind of ideal of bringing somebody along to sort of maybe fact check you as you went, or backstop you, or no, you were just pretty sure from the beginning you were going to convince her.
No, it's both, really. I mean, I think you described what I was looking for. I want to be challenged. I'm the only person in this case that would do any interview with anybody. I mean, the people that are on the other side of this case,
proof is here.
They don't want to have any discussion. They do not want to have any discussion. The people on the other side of this case do not want to be confronted. They don't want to be questioned. I mean, heck, I don't think you even know this, but one of your, I don't know if it was your direct adversary at the time, but Janelle Eschbach, who I know you know, was a big key part of the prosecution in this case. I sent her an email, a simple email, a few years ago, simple email asking her some questions. She sent me a cease and desist notice from her lawyers saying that I should never contact her or her family members ever again. I thought, wow, boy, That's a pretty telling response. That seems like somebody who has something to hide or doesn't feel very confident in what they did or what they believe. And that's just symptomatic of everybody. And so I want it all out there. And if, I wanted Liz to confront me when she thought I was wrong. I felt confident that I could not end my view, but as I said, convince her, believe that we did that. And I know we did that in totality. I mean, she may not of every little detail, but certainly in totality, in the big picture, she is, and she's a very credible person. She's somebody who, right after the podcast, went on to be a professor, ironically enough, at Syracuse University Newhouse School of Broadcasting, which is the #1 broadcast school in the country, and then Cronkite School at Arizona State. So this is someone who teaches news media, and she fully realizes that the news media blew this one in a spectacular fashion.
So just to touch on the podcast for a quick second, how many hours it's pretty extensive, right? What's it contain and how many hours is it?
Okay, well, it's a little bit difficult to define because when you say the podcast, so I'll tell you what we have. Okay, there are 19 episodes of With the Benefit of Hindsight. Those 19 episodes, some of those episodes are literally record length podcasts, like 4 or 5 hour episodes, which we know is unheard of, but no one's ever really complained because they're spectacular. And as you know, the nature of this case requires them, not just because it's so detailed, but because the burden of proof on our side is so absurd. Mm-hmm. You have to build a brick wall around every little thing you say. Otherwise, it all falls apart. So I would say of the 19 episodes, there's at least 60 hours of content there. But then we did something extraordinary. I've never been doing this, but I'm all about transparency. And that is we released the interviews of every for the podcast, which you can find at my website, framingpaterno.com. And it includes, an extensive interview with Bob Costas, members of the Penn State Board of Trustees, Franco Harris. There are 2 extremely long interviews. We'll get another one of the administrators,
right,
who went to jail in this case, who believes Jerry Sandusky is innocent. Let me emphasize that. Says innocent. He now believes him to be innocent. And so there's at least, I would say, 40 hours, somewhere in that range, of raw interviews that and this is all free, by the way. And until recently, there were no ads anywhere. And I think there's now ads on the podcast itself, but not on the interviews at framingpaterno.com. So I would say that in totality, there's probably about 100 hours or somewhere close to that of material that would be somewhat defined as the podcast.
So, one of the questions people would ask, and I know because they've asked it of me, is, so what are you guys talking about? Because obviously it's pretty simple. There was a trial up in State College. A jury heard all the evidence and they convicted the man, and he's really guilty, right? I mean, that's pretty much the pushback you get most of the time, right?
Of course. No, I mean, the number one hurdle that people have to overcome to even get into this podcast or this story is the notion that will be anything new, right? It's 10 years later. We know this story. And why are you bothering with us with this? Why, and why are you defending child molestation, which is, of course, absurd that no one's defending child molestation. But I think that there's a lot of different ways I have found, Karl, to get into this story. I found it to be a lot easier, especially for conservatives post-COVID, because, at least for me, magic words when I'm trying to convince a conservative that this might not be what you were told are just think about COVID and think about all the insane things over the last 3 years because of COVID policy. And there are a lot of similarities in the big picture, of how the COVID story developed and the narrative got set, the Penn State Sandusky narrative got set, both of which occurred in incredibly quick fashion of an unprecedented panic. And that's the key to this. Right. When it all starts, it's a panic. And the media is not competent they're not competent, period. But they're really not competent when it comes to highly emotionally charged issues in the middle of a panic. They grab on to whatever narrative works best for them, and then that's the truth, and there's no going back. And like COVID, in this particular story, Karl, one of the reasons why there's no going back is because of all the damage that was done. Like, right. For instance, in my view, mask mandates are insane, right? I mean, they're absolutely insane. They're anti-scientific. They did absolutely nothing. We caused millions and millions of kids, including my daughters, to go to school wearing masks simply to make liberals feel better about themselves. That's what we did. But no one can admit that. No one can admit that because, one, no one likes to admit they're wrong, but they really don't like to do wrong in cases where they cause great damage. No one wants damage. Less chance there is of going back and fix it. Duke lacrosse, which has got the false allegation against Duke lacrosse players of rape, got fixed. Why? Well, one, the evidence was overwhelming. Two, because the damage to those boys was great.
I think I lost your sound for a second there, John. I lost your sound. Yeah, I don't have your sound, John. I got technical difficulties, folks. Always with a live interview, as you can imagine, these things happen. I got to let him know. I don't think he knows we've lost his sound. So let's go to John. Lost your sound there for a second. I just sent you a message. All right, well, we got a little dead air, so I'm going to fill it for a second. John's going to try to get his sound reset here. Okay, maybe disconnect and reconnect. So he's going to disconnect and reconnect. That's my solution for the problem. Somehow he got muted during that garble session there. We'll never know what he was saying, but I'm sure when he comes back, it'll be good, right? So he'll be back in here in a second. It just takes a minute for this system to re-allow him back in. As soon as he comes in, I will pop him back on the air. This is an interesting interview because obviously I was a participant in the case, and I'm sure he has some questions for me, but I really want to interview him and see where he's coming from on this. I'm not sure where I'm going to stand on all this, but let's get John back on here. John, you're back on. I don't know if I see sound from you yet or not.
Karl, can you hear me now?
I got you. You're back. Welcome back, John. What were you saying? Yeah, I can hear you.
So you can hear me now? Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Anyway, I was trying to make the point about damage being done in particular cases and why it makes it more difficult for the media to revisit. And there are cases where the media can do this. Penn State Sandusky is not, because they put all their chips down. They destroyed 5 great men in ways that can never be restored. Not to mention a university, not to mention this went on for years. And so that is, you asked about how it is that this could happen and why people should revisit this. there are still things about this case that I'm learning 10 years later. In fact, when I spoke to you the other day, I learned a few things that I did not know. How in the world, and I've devoted my life to this for 10 years, how in the world did the media figure this out in 3 days or 4 days? Because that's what they did. In 3 or 4 days, they figured it's impossible.
So, John, let me tell you something that I always thought was interesting in the case was, as you recall, that grand jury presentment was leaked to the media. Now, it's my belief, based on pretty direct knowledge, that was leaked intentionally. But I always thought it was interesting how it was written, because if you parsed it, it was maybe, if you read it against the grand jury testimony, technically supportable, but not really, but written in a way that really harmed Joe Paterno, right out the writ. The reading that the media gave it was that Joe Paterno was given a very specific allegation and did nothing about it. But that's not actually what the grand jury testimony said. And it really wasn't. That presentment is not actually supported by the raw testimony. So you have a presentment that prosecutors wrote in a misleading way. And then that was leaked to the media in the middle of the night, so to speak, in a roundabout way. It was put up on the website and taken back down. And that was done intentionally, because I'm aware of several folks in the media that was leaked to, that was going to be put up and taken down. But I always thought the worst, talk about whose lives are destroyed or not destroyed. You can take, but the worst sin for me was right at the very beginning, the way they basically torpedoed Paterno out of the blue with a presentment that just wasn't true, the way it was written and the way it referenced Paterno. To me, that was a major flag as to what was going on. Now, was Corbett behind that? Do you know? Was that a Tom Corbett move?
Here's my theory on this. All right. And I agree with you. I mean, to me, the grand jury presentment comes down to 2 words. Anal intercourse. I mean, the fact that the anal intercourse of a 10-year-old boy, that was everything. I mean, that's the headline. Oh my God, Cherno was told about the anal intercourse of a 10-year-old boy in a Penn State shower, and all he did was tell his superiors about it. I mean, that sounds horrible. That did not happen. That did not happen. In fact,
it wasn't actually
happening.
If you parse the grand jury presentment, it doesn't literally say that, but it implies that. It says those words in one sentence. It implies that that's what he was told, but it was cleverly written, I can tell, so that you could say, well, Judge, I wasn't misleading, because a really smart person would have picked up on the fact that these are separate sentences, and therefore, kind of stuff lawyers might point out to other lawyers. But it was like the Willie Horton ad that Bush ran many years ago. It didn't matter what you actually said. It was what impression it gave. And then the media ran with that immediately. And that bell has never been unrung.
I may differ a little.
Paterno. But go ahead. Have you read the grand jury testimony?
We may how that went. I've read what's publicly available. I'm sure.
Right. I would just tell you it's my distinct impression.
It's unbelievable that we still do not.
It's my distinct impression that presentment does not line up with the grand jury testimony. I can't be more specific than that, right?
Well,
I'll take my law license away.
Okay. Well, I'm sure. Okay. Well, I'm quite sure that I'm quite sure that's the case. But we may differ slightly on how that was intended. You're making the argument the prosecution was going after Joe Paterno, and I would submit that doesn't make any sense. And here's my theory of what went down. Okay, so you have to remember one of the most absurd parts of the destruction of Joe Paterno is not just pretend that the Jerry Sandusky allegations are true, which you and I both know they're not. But let's pretend they're true for a second. The most absurd part about destroying Joe Paterno is that without Joe Paterno and his quote unquote testimony, Jerry Sandusky never gets arrested. And that is a fact. Joe Paterno is the only thing person or thing backing up their star witness, Mike McQueary. He is the most trusted man in the state of Pennsylvania at the time. So had Joe Paterno in that grand jury said, which would have, by the way, lined up with what he told police before the grand jury testimony,
right,
I'm sure you're aware of, that there was nothing sexual here, that I don't really remember Mike saying anything like there being a sex act. This doesn't make any sense to me. If that had been Joe Paterno's testimony, which in my view would have been accurate, but we're dealing with an 84-year-old man who's very insecure about losing his memory. And he's being coached by his son, Scott, who's a Republican lobbyist. This is key. Scott Paterno is his lawyer and his son. Scott is a Republican lobbyist. This prosecution is being run by a Republican team. Tom Corbett is the Republican governor. He's the former attorney general. They have Scott Paterno by the balls. Okay? So Scott is deeply invested in this in not doing anything to disrupt this investigation. And when Paterno's grand jury testimony is so big, and the prosecution not particularly helpful, not as helpful as they'd like or need, they go back to Joe Paterno in October of 2011. The last thing they do, Karl, before they arrest Jerry, is they go back to Joe in his home. And there's one other person with him in his home. One other person. That person is Scott Paterno. So an investigator, Joe, and Scott Paterno are in Joe Paterno's house. And they go through one more time to make sure Joe is absolutely on record, backing up Mike McQueary. And in this instant, Joe backs up McQueary to the hilt. And I would submit the reason why that happened is because Scott was there making sure that Joe backed his guy, which was his natural inclination, his assistant coach, his former quarterback, backing him to the hilt. If Joe doesn't do that, if when they come to Joe in October 2011, and Joe says, guys, I've been thinking about it. I don't know what Mike told me. I can't remember. It was 10, 11 years. I don't even know what date this was. If that had been his reaction, could not have arrested Jerry Sandusky. So, because if they arrest Sandusky and then Joe says that publicly, their case is done.
So let me just say,
you see what I'm saying?
I don't
Karl?
know. Yeah, no, I got you. And I don't.
Joe is their star.
I don't know what the interaction between Scott and Joe and the investigators is because I'm not there, right? I mean, you have a theory, but I will say this: at trial, it was proven that at least on one occasion, the police went off tape recorder but didn't actually go off tape recorder, and were telling a witness what other witnesses were saying, and then went back on, and then magically his testimony changed. We know that happened. We also know that in another instance, a young man refused to say that anything had happened to him repeatedly. And every time the police would re-interview him and he would say nothing had happened, they would get angry with him. And on like the fifth or sixth visit, they threatened to throw him in jail for lying because he wouldn't say that something happened to him. He was actually called as a defense witness to explain the police conduct in the case. So while I wasn't there and I don't know, I would certainly say there was a lot of evidence in the case that the government was trying very hard to shape witness testimony in ways that, frankly, are beyond the pale. And two of those instances came out in open court.
Right. So, and I believe that Joe Paterno was manipulated, too. I believe that Joe Paterno's better nation was used again. You have to remember, Joe Republican. It's a Republican administration, Republican pro-prosecution. Joe is got a son, I just said, is a Republican lobbyist. Scott wants Joe on the prosecution team. Scott becomes convinced on that Jerry Tell and his strategy to save Joe is to separate Joe as much from Jerry as possible. Scott did Jerry Sandusky from Jerry Glanville. Danville. All right. He never had a conversation with him. He had no idea about the accusers. All he knew was, we like Mike. Mike is the star witness. We need to be on Mike's side. And Joe ends up going on Mike's side in October in 2011 in that interview I referenced. And that's when they decide we've got enough to finally arrest Jerry Sandusky. So this idea that somehow the presentment was intended to get Joe Paterno, I don't believe is true. I think that was collateral damage that they did not anticipate. And here's what just to finish this thought, Carl, because I think this is important.
Right.
I'm a big timeline person. Timeline is everything. And in this case, it's really everything. And with regard to the news media timeline on this, here's what happens. On that Friday, the grand jury presentment gets leaked. Ganem just happens to be at home on a Friday night and just happens to be on the website to be able to get the grand jury present before it gets leaked, right? So now the story breaks over the week, which Penn State is not playing a game that weekend. They're off. The previous weekend, Joe Paterno had just become the winningest coach in the history of college football, all right? Over that weekend, it is my belief, this is purely my belief in a scenario that makes some sense. I think the prosecution thought that this was going to be a nuclear explosion on its own. That the Jerry Sandusky allegation on its own would be so huge that they would get what they wanted, which was their whole case. And you know this because they were medicating this from Susana, the detective who should have never been on this case because he was a narcotics guy, not a drug, not a sex abuse guy. But Susano said, if we get publicity out there, we're going to get a whole slew of really good accusers, because then it'll be like the Catholic Church case, right? The people will come out of the woodwork. And even though we don't have a strong case now, we're going to have a really strong case once this becomes public because the media is going to go bananas. Well, guess what happened over that weekend? Outside of State College, nothing. No one gave a shit because no one remembered who Jerry Sandusky was. No one cared who Jerry Sandusky was. He was a former from 11 years earlier. Cared. And so the prosecution looked around and was like, wait a minute, we just and that much has happened. We need some more gasoline on this fire. So then on Monday, they have a press conference, and that's when the police commissioner is Joe Paterno's role in this. Poor gas liar. That's when they throw Joe Paterno under the bus, because now they
the state police became the moral police on that. The state police became the moral police all of a sudden. It wasn't really a crime, but it was a terrible thing to do.
The state
we regulate that now. Yeah.
He failed in his moral responsibility. That something to that
like
effect.
A James
what
Comey,
was said about Joe Paterno.
Hillary Clinton.
From that moment,
like a James Comey.
Okay. So they throw Joe Paterno under the bus, and that's when the flame is lit, the nuclear bomb goes off nationally, and ESPN goes 24/7 on this story, because now it's a Joe Paterno story. Now we got box office, because we got a current coach who's a legend, who's a celebrity, who just became the winningest coach in the history of college football, and he's got a home game this Saturday. And guess who's in that game? Guess who's carrying that game live? Holy cow, it's ESPN. So now we got a week's worth of material right when the NBA is on strike, baseball just finished, hockey no one gives a shit about, college basketball hasn't started yet, we got NFL's in a lull, we got nothing going on this week. But now we got a greedy on our hands, because what did Joe Paterno do? Look at this grand jury presentment. He was told about the anal rape of a child, and he did nothing. The great Joe Paterno. Oh my God. And so this drives the coverage for 2.5 days. Yes, Carl.
Well, the reason I wondered about the affidavit being written the way it was, the presentment, I should say, is I'm aware of another media outlet who was made aware of the leak, and they hesitated to pull the trigger because they wanted confirmation, and they got scooped by the Patriot News. But my understanding is they knew when to look at the website because a couple people had been tipped. And I understand that would play either with Sandusky being the target to rev things up, or with Paterno. But I always felt like the affidavit was written to throw Paterno under the bus. And I felt like that was early in the case, like right from the beginning.
To what end, Karl? He's their star witness. To what end? To what end?
I always felt
throwing Paterno under the bus.
I always felt it's what you thought, which is to rev the case up. I really listen. Frank Fina, who ran that,
it's kind of academic at this point because it
really. But it pollutes it because it goes back to what you said: is how do you unring the bell? And that's the coverage that everybody remembers, right? That's the thumbnail sketch that everybody has of the case, and that's about where their knowledge ends. I mean, maybe
we're getting bogged down on what is an interesting but
right,
frankly tangential point. Although let me just Karl, let me just finish with this on Paterno. It is somewhat trivial as to what the motivation was, but it's not trivial as to how this case goes and breaks down, because Joe Paterno is everything to this case. Everything. I cannot emphasize this enough. I have a constant conversation with a mainstream reporter that I put you in touch with. I hope you'll talk to shortly. I know he's eager to speak to you, who's been working on this case for a couple of years, but he's not a sports guy. And I am constantly trying to explain that without Joe Paterno, there's no Jerry Sandusky rush to judgment. The Joe Paterno angle is why there was massive media coverage. It's why there was the Bob Costas interview. It's why everyone presumed that Penn State was pleading Sandusky's crimes by firing Paterno and Graham Spanier, who has a book coming out, the president of the university. None of this makes any sense to people because they're not understanding the timeline and the motivations. And so if you take away, let's pretend in a rational world had just said, this is very troubling allegations about Jerry Sandusky. Get back to us when you have trial, and we'll see whether or not any of our people are guilty of anything. But until then, we're going to go on with life. If that had been Penn State's response, which it should have been, if that had been Penn State's response, I believe that Jerry Sandusky doesn't go on trial for 3 or 4 years, if ever, because over that 3 or 4 years, without any momentum, I'm sorry.
Part of Penn State's problem, part of Penn State's problem, as we learned later, right, was the fact that they never got competent legal counsel. They had Madam Baldwin, the former Supreme Court justice, up there, misrepresenting the clients in front of the grand jury and giving early advice in this case, like, oh, don't worry, and I feel like if they had hired competent criminal lawyers and competent PR people right from the beginning, they probably would have taken a slightly more nuanced approach to the whole case. But those guys, Graham Spanier and them, and the board, I don't know who else knew, but to my knowledge, they never got a real criminal defense lawyer to look over these grand jury subpoenas or the whole thing that was going on. So they ended up neck deep in it, in panic mode. That's what I think. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I've spoken to Graham Spanier. I've spoken to Graham Spanier many times over many hours. I've done what I be the definitive interview with Spanier, which you can find at with the benefit of hindsight. I believe it's episode 17 or 18. It's 4.5 hours long. To me, if you listen to that interview and you think that any of this is real, you're delusional. But here's the thing, Karl. I think we've seen this many times. In fact, we saw a situation occur this weekend. It's eerily similar at BYU. The essence of academia is, no matter where it is, it's always liberal. And the liberal DNA says to cave immediately. Cave immediately. That is in the DNA. We must cave. Now, ironically, Spanier is a liberal, was the only person who said, hey, wait a minute. Maybe we shouldn't be throwing our own people under the bus. And he got thrown under the bus because of it. So the Penn State case was what I call the original virginal case, where Penn State's reaction had nothing to do with facts, nothing to do with logic, nothing to do with it was, oh my God, being attacked. We plead guilty. This times will like us or get off our back, and we can show how virtuous we are by throwing our own bus. That is what Penn State did. Did it in record time. Joe Paterno, who was supposedly so powerful, got fired over a cell phone taken to him by a bicycle carrier in the middle of the night on the Wednesday before what was supposed to be his last home game. I always say to people who say that Joe Paterno ran the university, I said, well, that's not a lot of power when you get fired in that fashion. And so to me, there was never any chance of Penn State defending itself, because especially once Joe Paterno was fired and Spanier is fired, because now they're invested in their own guilt. They put $100 million on the table, which made it very easy for the prosecution to keep their case together, because all those guys knew they were going to get paid huge bucks once Jerry was convicted. That's why I say if this goes down in a different way and we wait 3 or 4 years like should have happened before a trial, and these guys start to doubt whether or not Penn State's going to cough up money, and they get a little older and they start to realize, wait a minute, I'm not telling the truth here. This doesn't feel right. And one drops off and another one nervous and another one drops off, and there's no forward momentum. I believe the case never goes to trial. Instead, Karl, I'm amazed. I think one of the great weaknesses in the prosecution case is that prosecution at the time of Jerry's arrest has 6 accusers, 6 human accusers. All right? Only 2, by the way, claim actual sex acts, but they have 6 human accusers at the time of trial. Time of arrest. They get this massive explosion, unprecedented worldwide coverage for this serial pedophile. He is deemed to be guilty in the eyes of the entire world. And they only add 2 more accusers, both of whom, as you know, are awful. Mm-hmm. Awful. Number 9 and number 10. They're awful. To me, right there shows the absurdity of the prosecution case. By their own theory of the case, they were expecting to get inundated by better accusers. They hated Aaron Fisher, victim number 1. You know that. They hated him. They thought he was terrible. That's why they were as the star with number 4.
Now, they how would I say it? They kept threatening, like with these imaginary, they'd say, oh, like, if you guys don't waive the preliminary hearing, we might charge victims 11 through 17. And, we've talked to victim 28. And you see sometimes in the documents references to higher victim numbers. But interestingly, none of those panned out, right? They were never comfortable bringing those charges. And by the way, what I know, which is, had they actually had more victims beyond the number that they brought to trial, obviously they would have charged that subsequent, right? Because everybody always does the pile-on victory lap when they have it. Plus, it's hard to explain to families, your kid really wasn't a victim or was a victim, but we're not going to get justice for your kid. So most of the time, if you have somebody that gets convicted and then a bunch of people come out of the woodwork, you get the tack-on charges, the add-on charges, the new and continuing indictments. And that just simply didn't happen in this case, which is interesting if you know the fact that they were floating much higher numbers.
Also, along those lines, interesting, Karl, and I don't know how much. Also interesting. I don't know how much you've given to this. Why was there were reports of a federal investigation in this case? Victim number 4 testified that he to be used. Why was there never any federal charges filed in this case? Because no federal prosecutor wanted the fame and glory of a federal conviction of Jerry Sandusky. It should have been a slam dunk. right?
I always felt that they brought the FBI in on some things, and it's hard to put your finger on it, but it never felt like the FBI was fully on board with the state, if that makes sense. Like they provided some forensic assistance, but it never felt like the federal element of the investigation ever took off. So in that regard, like you're saying, I mean, what happened with it? It just didn't feel like there was any love. Sometimes, when these things are prosecuted at the state level, there's an agreement with the U.S. attorney not to take over a case or not to federalize something. But I never got the feeling here. I got the feeling here, quite frankly, that there just wasn't anything that they wanted to pursue.
Right. And who knows why, but the fact that there was never any federal charges, I find interesting. But more importantly, I can't emphasize enough the utter garbage that came forward after Jerry Sandusky's arrest, Joe Paterno's firing, the massive firestorm, the Bob Costas disastrous interview. If Jerry Sandusky was guilty, there would have been dozens of highly credible people who would have come forward. Instead, you got number 9, who tells the most ridiculous story of the entire trial, and number 10, who never met Jerry Sandusky. Him. And so to me, that's game, set, match. You have flimsy allegations at the time of arrest.
So and you yelled at me when we first talked because you said, so Karl, do you think Jerry's innocent? And I said, well, as a lawyer, and you're like, that's a lawyer's answer. That's a lawyer's answer. And I always just said, I don't have an opinion on guilt or innocence of anybody I've ever represented because I never cared about whether they were guilty or innocent when I take the case. What I will tell you, though, is I've been involved in cases where when you lose, you can say, I know why I lost because there's a videotape of my client committing the act that the government alleged, and he confessed to the police. And the only reason we had a trial is they wouldn't flex off a mandatory sentence. And we were hoping, we could get a lesser conviction, or we disagreed on we didn't disagree whether my client killed a person. We just disagreed about the specific intent or lack thereof, those kinds of things. This was truly one of the cases where when you look at the evidence and what was presented, if you believed certain witnesses, right, i.e. the person who says, I was the victim in the room with the guy and this is what he did to me. As I always used to tell clients, this. If I go into the alley with your mother and your mother comes out and says that I raped her, I could be convicted of rape. Now, the lack of forensic evidence, the lack of corroboration, my personal history, my knowledge, all these kinds of things could come into play, and a jury could convict me or acquit me, and would likely acquit me without something. But if 2 mothers say I did it, right, then probably the jury's like, well, I got 2 people saying. So is there technically sufficient evidence based on the government's theory for certain victims? The answer that the courts have said so far is yes, right? And as a lawyer, I would say that's plausible for a conviction. But on the other hand, I would tell you, this is the kind of case where it was very troubling because there was evidence that the government was telling witnesses what to say and giving witnesses the fact pattern, right? Because they go to the jury and they say, look, he does it the same way every time. And then you find out that they, in fact, were telling witnesses, this is what the other guys are saying, i.e. another guy said. And then you don't know if they told that guy this stuff. So it's a case where, having even been in the courtroom, I can see why a jury would convict somebody based on the evidence that was presented to them. But I can also tell you that if I had a chance to retry that case, oh no, John, listen, I have had many clients.
Karl, that's bullshit.
You can tell me
bullshit. Karl, what you just said is total bullshit. What you just said is total bullshit, and it's bullshit.
Ziegler,
first of all, Jerry is.
If a guy takes the stand and says,
Jerry is
this
innocent,
guy did
I don't know why you won't
say
it.
Wait. John, stop for 1 second. I know you're an advocate at this point and you're an investigator, but I want you to think about something.
No.
The jury is told, listen,
John, said is not true. What you just said is not true.
It doesn't matter. Truth is not what court is about, John. Have you figured that out yet? Have you figured out that court's not about the truth yet?
Karl.
Have you figured that out?
Karl, can you show me? Can you please show me? Now, you said said the fact that the conviction was based upon the evidence. Can you please find for me another modern day serial pedophile, Jerry's age, who was convicted without any of the following? No pornography, none, zero, zip, zilch. No drugs, no alcohol, no plying of any way, shape, or form, no physical abuse, no confession, no plea bargain, nothing, no drugs, nothing even in the realm of what is normally a very, very, very tried and true pattern of a serial pedophile. I have never found any conviction of a serial pedophile without
John,
one of those things. Without one of those things. No DNA, obviously.
I represented a guy who got 30 to 60 years for 3 counts of rape years ago. And he would fit your bill except for one thing. He had pornography. And by pornography, he had a Playboy. And the Perry County judge allowed the government to show that this guy had a Playboy magazine as proof that he was the kind of scumbag that would possess pornography and therefore might have molested these girls. I think he was wholly innocent. But I had many cases where people who did nothing were acquitted and convicted and hung charges. When a witness takes the stand, a jury is free to believe some, all, or none of their testimony. Some, all, or none. There is, as a matter of law, sufficient evidence in the case. It's very poor quality. And if the jury knew everything that was going on investigatively, I think they may have reached a different verdict. But if you just went on the fact that, did anybody take the stand and point at the guy and say, that's the guy that did it to me? And if the answer to that is yes, then a conviction can lie, right? I mean, that's the law. I can't change the law.
We have
I know you don't like
different.
I know you don't like that answer.
No, I don't understand why you, especially at this point, all these years later, you're hiding behind that. I don't get it. But if
I'm not hiding behind
that's
it.
what you need to do. But the reality,
I'm not hiding behind it.
The reality is that the reality is Jerry Sandusky is clearly innocent. You know that. He did not do these things. It was not possible for him to do these things. One of the things that didn't get mentioned, unfortunately, is his records, which you now know about. Which
I did not know about that.
Alone, this that's amazing that you didn't know about the medical records. Good co-counsel Joe Amendola, in my view, didn't bother to read them, and he sloshed off the low testosterone issue. And then if he had actually read records, he would have seen that during the time period of number 9 and number 1's allegations, Jerry Sandusky was diagnosed as having testicular matter, virtually no testicular matter. A man in his 60s with no testosterone, no testicles, is anally raping teenage boys in his basement while his wife is upstairs baking cookies. Bullshit. There's no chance. And why did not one of these boys ever, men, not boys, ever say that Jerry Sandusky had no testicles? Because they never saw his testicles. Because he's innocent. Because they never saw anything. Because there was no sex abuse.
And some people may think the point you're making is strange, but many years ago I was involved in a case with a man who had a very large belly, and his belly actually hung down over his genitalia. And that actually was an issue in the case because a female who said that he had, required her to give him a oral sex. And I know it's getting into the weeds, but the way she described it was physically impossible, and that was actually palpable to the jury because it was something you could show them. And those kinds of things become important. I had a case one time, hold on one second. I had a rape case one time.
Karl, you had Karl.
Yeah, I had a rape case one time where the jury wanted to see a bicycle. And the bicycle was the alternative source of the injury. And even though a bunch of the jurors wanted to convict each time, it was hung twice, the jurors who wanted to convict still said, well, we would have liked to have seen the bicycle. And I'm like, well, what the hell do you need to see the bicycle for? If you want to convict the guy, you think he did it. They're like, yeah, but if we saw the bicycle, but the bicycle was lost in the midst of time. So we know that showing these things to jurors can make a big difference. So I don't think you're completely out there when you say that kind of material. Now, that doesn't preclude it. It makes it very improbable, right? But it doesn't. That's the one problem in law. You can't preclude it with that. The judge is going to grant you an acquittal.
No, I didn't ask for that. I would say, though, that any juror who's using their brain would go, wait a minute, why did not one accuser ever mention anything about Jerry's lack of testicles when supposedly Aaron Fisher was forced to be giving him oral sex 100 times by his own final testimony, although he's told so many different stories, he probably has no idea, how many times he supposedly gave Jerry Sandusky oral sex. But I'm surprised, with this logistic thing, that you never mentioned what happened in the Sandusky case. And I believe you were the person who was the point man at this, where the prosecution tried, and even the very biased against Sandusky judge was like, what the heck is this? Tried to enter into evidence pictures taken in the shower where he used a mannequin of the boy.
Yeah.
And they put the mannequin on her so that it would be tall enough for a man to anally penetrate. Right? Do I have it right, Karl?
I was successful in keeping a number of those images out because they weren't accurate, right? Because the government had these crazy theories, and I'm like, you can't show that. Yeah, that was all litigated, but like everything else, some got in, some did not, right?
But how insane is that? How insane?
Well, okay, it's insane because they literally had to create a scenario, right, with the mannequins that wouldn't have worked. Like, in other words, in order for to set this up, in order for McQuarrie to have seen what he claimed he saw, right, which he didn't always claim he saw, but sometimes he did and sometimes he didn't, they had to create a factually impossible situation with the mannequins to back him up, right? I mean, isn't that where we're going with this? And which is just bizarre, but that's the extent of the government. Like, they'll try to slide that stuff in there, right? In a way, you almost like, do I want to let these images in just to show how absurd it is? Or do I not want to let these images in? It reminds me of all your murder cases where you're going through all the autopsy photos and the government's trying to put in every murder scene photo and every autopsy photo. And you're explaining to the judge, like, well, this one shows a lot of red blood. And the judge is like, well, I'll make it black and white. Objection overruled if it's black and white. And it's always a give and take in court. And my joke always is, if you're a good attorney, what you should do is come with 10 pieces of evidence that you want to get in when you only actually want to get 1 or 2 of them in. The judge will be like, oh, well, I already denied these guys these 4 things, so I'll let you have these 2 to be fair.
I actually wish that the judge had allowed that in, because it would have been.
I understand why, right. And listen, the Superior Court, right? I said to that judge, he refused to instruct on prompt complaint. This is a major issue in Pennsylvania. It's a simple issue, right? You must instruct on prompt complaint. And then the Superior Court's just like, yeah, Rominger's right. You need to instruct on prompt complaint, but who cares? Not in this case. That one really threw me. That one really threw me, because we really believe prompt complaint is important in the law. It's always been important.
So what else do you want to know, Karl? I'm happy to answer why Jerry Sandusky is innocent.
So, John, you mentioned something to me that I thought was interesting. You've said that the entire timeline, this entire key conversation where Mike McQuarrie says that he told Joe Paterno what happened, and that's what leads to Joe Paterno sending the email up the chain and all this sort of thing. You think you can kind of show that that's not what happened. So maybe you should tell us about that, because I think that is a key issue in the case that you've developed. And this is the kind of thing, by the way, what you said is, I'm still learning new things. So.
All right. My greatest discovery, as well as my greatest mistake in this case, deals with the date of the so-called McQuarrie episode. And if Jerry Sandusky was going on trial today, let's pretend, right? And I had the knowledge that I have now, and I was your co-counsel, mm-hmm. I would have been passionately making the case that the date itself proves that the case against Sandusky is without merit. Here's the shortest version I give you, and we deal with it extensively in episode number 1 of With the Benefit of Hindsight. But here's the very short version. All right, when the presentment comes out in November 2011, the prosecution is claiming, and it's important to point out, this is not just an arbitrarily come to date. They just threw a date against the wall. This is after months and months of investigation on their part, going through his recollection, questioning him, trying to find corroborating evidence. They come up with the date of March 1st, 2002. Now, bizarrely, Karl, recently see news reports in 2022 that still have the wrong date of March 1st, 2002. But that was the date that it was originally reported. That was the date that Joe Paterno thought this episode that destroyed his career occurred when he died a couple months after the firestorm. It was not until early 2012, just a little bit before you guys were forced to go to trial with no continuance, that the prosecution very, very quietly suddenly says, this is interesting. We need to make an adjustment on the McQueary episode. Because we found these emails, which would later become extremely important in other cases. We found these emails, and guess what? Oops, March 1st, 2002, which was a Friday. By the way, you may recall this, that the prosecution was very, very proud of the fact that this March 1st date was the first day of spring break in state, so that Jerry had this expectation of privacy in the Penn State lockers, would have this all to himself, where he could rape young boys without any concern of someone finding him because it's spring break and there's no one around. And Mike had said it was a night on campus. Well, then come out in a statement, they go, oops, guess what? It was 2002. It was actually 2001. It wasn't March. It was actually February, and it wasn't the first of the day of the month. It was actually the 9th of the month. Yes, that February 9th, 2001 was the new day. Now, I will never forget seeing that article in ESPN, and I think, what? Wait, what? We are going to place everything that's happening to Joe Paterno. At that time, I was only concerned about Joe Paterno because I presumed Jerry Sandusky was guilty. We're going to place everything on the recollection, the 10-year-old recollection of Mike McQueary, who got the date, the month, and the year totally wrong. This isn't going to raise alarm bells. And it did not. The media just went, oh, okay. No, there were no questions about what that meant about Mike's credibility. And then the February 9th date is based upon the fact that these emails indicate that Mike went to go see Joe Paterno on the morning of February 10th, 2000, Saturday morning. We know that because of emails within the Penn State system. Joe Paterno didn't do emails, but he immediately informed Tim Curley, the athletic director, Gary Schultz, the senior president. So these emails make it very clear that it was the morning of February 10th. And here's where I made my biggest mistake, Karl. When I interviewed Jerry Sandusky in prison, the first time, I've interviewed him twice, but the first time I did it and I recorded it with a secret recording pen against the rules of the Pennsylvania, which is a whole nother story that's hilarious. When I recorded that, there was one thing, I was presuming Jerry was a pedophile, but I'm also open to the idea that even a pedophile might be telling me the truth about something, right? He's not going to necessarily lie about everything. And if there was one thing I knew he knew in his bones, Karl, he knew in his bones, that February 9th, 2001 date was wrong. And I found that odd because I thought, wait, how could the prosecution possibly have gotten that incredibly important fact wrong twice? That just seems implausible. And I asked him, I said, so why don't you think that date is right? And he said, well, it just doesn't seem like the right time of year. He knew who the boy in the shower was, a guy by the name of Alan Myers. And he knew that he would never have taken Alan Myers out of school. And he knew that episode had occurred for a long travel day with Alan. Now, he didn't tell me Alan's name at the time. I figured this out on my own and then went back to him and verified this. So in his mind, he couldn't figure out how February 9th, I'm sorry.
Yes,
Karl?
That individual was subject to an agreement between Amendola and Frank Fina to not mention the existence of the knowledge that either side knew who the actual person was. at trial. You agree
which
with
is
that?
unbelievable, and it's a horrendous move by Joe Amendola, but we can get into that shortly. So let me just finish the story because this is critical. So, so one of the first things I did after I got out of prison with Jerry Sandusky, my world is in a tailspin, and I'm planning on going on the Today Show to do an interview with Matt Lauer about all this with the recordings and all. I do a cursory investigation into February 9th. And this is where I really dropped the ball, partially because I was very busy. I'm a one-man band. I'm unpaid. I have no resources. I investigated whether or not Alan Myers went to school that day on February 9th. Is it possible that he had the off, right? And so I contacted his school and got the secretary to find an old calendar. And sure enough, Alan Myers had school on February 9th, 2001. I thought, wow. Okay, that's weird. And then I thought, well, maybe Jerry is either mistaken or maybe he's pulling some really great. Because at this point, again, maybe he's a criminal mastermind and he's manipulating me with, which I would later laugh at because Jerry Sandusky right. Naive dumb and he's not capable of being a master manipulator. But but I'm thinking this doesn't make sense. I got too much. This was a massive mistake. Massive. It's my greatest regret from a knowledge standpoint in the case. Because if I had gone down that path and really just done, it would have been a pretty extensive investigation. But it was possible if I had found out the following things before I went on the Today Show. That would have been the headline of my Today Show interview, which was McQueary got the date wrong twice. And that he did so in a way that was incredibly substantive. And here's how I was able to put this together. So on February 9th, the reason why it's February 9th, Karl, is not because there's any, Mike wrote in a diary February 9th that this happened. It's because the prosecution needs February 9th, the night of February 9th, to be the date because they know he goes to see Joe Paterno in the morning of the 10th. And if it's not the 9th, there's no urgency. Right? You have to have to see on Mike McQueary's part to go see somebody. Now he's not going to police,
right?
But he's going to see Joe Paterno. That's the best the prosecution can get. So they need this to be as urgent as possible. And one night is the most that they can possibly deal with. One night is plausible, right? It happens at night. You don't want to wake Joe up. He's an old man. You talk to your dad and his friend, Dr. Dranoff. And next morning you go see Joe Paterno. That's at least somewhat plausible. Somewhat if you saw a rape. However,
and let me stop you. Let me stop you here because this is interesting. And the reason I find it interesting is one thing I could never wrap my mind around was when I got stuck cross-examining, and you know why I say stuck cross-examining, McQueary's father and Dranoff and McQueary. There was no urgency on their part in the sense of Mike saw something and it was a terrible thing and it was a rape, but they didn't call the police and they didn't call children and youth and they didn't call campus security and they didn't call. And so you were always wondering, like, if they really saw that or had this terrible image in their mind of an ongoing act, knowing that the one guy's a doctor, right, and is a mandatory reporter, and presumably, and there's no reason to believe, by the way, that any of these people would support this kind of terrible action if it was in fact what he saw. So it was always like, I just find it hard to believe that you didn't immediately do something. But now what you're saying is not only did they not wait a day, but maybe coinciding with what I always thought was that McQueary didn't actually see anything nefarious. Was the reason why it wasn't handled as such a big deal. But go on. But I just think that fits your theory. Actually fits one of the lingering questions.
Well, that's good to hear. So let me get to the good part. Okay, here's what I wish I had done before the Today Show interview. The key part of my version of this story, which changed many times, as you know, is that this was a very quiet night on campus. That was clear to him. Now, that's something that's hard to misremember, right? I mean, you can't misremember that. I mean, because you're saying that nothing was going on. And well, here's the problem. Here's the problem with February 9th. February 9th was probably the busiest night on campus of that entire winter. right across the street from the Lash building where this apparently allegedly happened was a sold out rock concert across the street. In the building itself. Now, Gary Schultz, who is the vice president of administration, says this is a bigger deal than the rock concert going on at the exact time when he says this episode occurred, which would have been about 9:00 at night. At that exact time, Penn State's hockey team is playing a game in the building. In the building. Gary says Mike would have even found parking. So the idea that he thought that was a very quiet night is impossible. It's literally impossible. There's another thing that if I was
John, let me stop. Let me stop you to reinforce this. What you're saying is, we know the government says it's the 9th because the email went on the 10th, and that it must have happened the night before. And you're saying the physical circumstances on campus do not coincide with as they were described as McQueary. And so basically, that date can't be right, but that's the only date they can use because otherwise it doesn't fit their narrative and the entire story. And we know they've already changed the date once and gone through all this rigmarole about, oh, oops, we were wrong about the date, but we found a new date. But the details that you learned that I didn't know, right, about this rock concert and some of these other things, become incredibly salient because they directly contradict the testimony of the whole setup for that time period. Am I getting it right?
All right, and so let me go down that. Yes, 100%. You're 100% right here, Carl. We're on the same page. So let me keep here because it gets even better. So there's a couple other things that are problematic about February 9th. Number one is, I think you're a pretty decent college football fan. Back in this era of college football, National Signing Day was a huge deal. You didn't commit anytime you wanted, decommit, transfer all the time. Today, but back in this era, there was one day when you found out which kids were coming to your school and which weren't. And for Mike McQueary, who was a graduate assistant at that time, desperate in need of a job, which we'll get to shortly, this is everything. National Signing Day is everything for him. It's his Christmas. It is his Christmas day. He's finding out which kids he recruited are coming to Penn State and which did not. And guess what day National Signing Day was that year? It was February. Number one, 2 days later, he's still in mode of reviewing what the hell happened on National Signing Day. As a witness, and you know this, people, they peg things with their memory, right?
Right.
If this really had happened after National Signing Day, he would have pegged it immediately. Oh my God. I was so busy. I went over to the Lash building to get some information on a recruit for some reason on a Friday night. Oh my God, let me tell you what I saw with Jerry Sandusky and a boy. And I'll never forget it. And I'll never forget the date because that was such a busy week. None of that happened. Because when this occurred, what did happen on February 8th of that year, which was normal, being National Signing Day. After National Signing Day, all changed because you stay with the team till recruitment's over, then you leave. February 8th of that year, 2001, Kenny Jackson leaves the Penn State Nittany Lions to go to the Pittsburgh Steelers. He was the wide receivers coach. This is the job that Mike McQueary wanted. And I would submit, Carl, that it makes a hell of a lot more sense that on February 9th, when it is in the newspaper, back when newspapers mattered, we didn't have social media. You didn't find out things instantaneously. So the morning of February 9th, Mike McQueary reads in the newspaper, which is where it was reported, that Kenny's leaving, right? February 9th, he get the idea, oh my God, this is the job I want. How am I going to go get this? And that is when he starts to think about, how am I going to get fame with Joe Paterno? And it's the learning on February 9th that gets him to go see Joe on the morning of the 10th, not witnessed Jerry Sandusky raping a boy. By the way, just from a pure chance level, what are the chances that McQuarrie witnesses Jerry Sandusky raping a young boy in Penn State the same day that the job he opens up? That's just statistically almost impossible, right? But
so
let me go back to the job thing. So what?
You're gonna tie this together here, I know, but
yes,
what I'd be asking, because I'm gonna pretend I'm my audience here for a second, because I already know the answer kind of, but I think the question I now have is, okay, I'm following that, but he's still going to tell him we know something on the 10th that causes an email. So what does he tell him on the 10th, or why does he need to tell him something on the 10th?
Okay, so now that we know that the 9th isn't the day, now I'm like, okay, so what is the day, right? We know it's not that week because there's no urgency. He's not waiting more than a day, to do this because he's supposed the rape of a boy. So what is the date? Well, now I go back to Jerry Sandusky, because now Jerry Sandusky is a credible person to me, right? Because Jerry wasn't right and Jerry was correct. So now Jerry Sandusky has some credibility. So I go back to what he told me. And Jerry, part of why that February 9th date isn't right is because I wouldn't have taken Alan Myers out of school. But I remember this episode that Penn State ended up asking me about being connected to two things. My book coming out, his infamous, that the prosecution tried to use as somehow a confession, which obviously was not. It was just very ironically, unfortunately titled. And me being up for the Virginia head coaching job. He said that those two things were attached in his brain to the episode that he was told by Penn State somebody witnessed in a Penn State shower.
Right.
Well, we then go back, and I had a supporter find an incredibly important newspaper article. The newspaper article is from December 31st, the Sunday of the year 2000. So it's December 31st, talking about something that happened on Saturday, the 30th. Mm-hmm. And on Saturday, it's a feature on Sandusky, and he's doing a book signing, his first book signing in State College for his book Touched, on that Saturday, December 30th. And he learns on that day that he does not get the Virginia head football coaching job. Al Groh got that job. So that happened on the same day. And then his recollection was taking Alan Myers across the state from a signing back to State College. Well, guess what? On December 29th, there was a book signing in Washington, PA, where across the state from State College. Mm-hmm. So here's what together, and I have a great interview with Jerry Sandusky's college roommate, who had no idea why I was calling him, who was very interested in what was going on at this time because he had a son that was going to the University of Virginia. So here he has his former college roommate potentially being the head coach of the school where his son's going to school, right? So this is very memorable for him. And he and Jerry have a phone conversation while Jerry's making a pit stop trying to pump his car with gas on the way from Washington to State College on December 29th of 2000. So now this is all starting to fit together. Here's what happens. On December 29th, Jerry starts in Washington, PA, does a book signing, a lunch that afternoon. He and Alan Myers drive from Washington to State College. They have a workout in State College. They then go and take a shower together, which Alan Myers was 13 plus years old at that time, an athlete, 2.5 years from winning a high school varsity letter on his team. He was not a young child. He considers Sandusky to be a surrogate dad. They take a shower. McQuarrie is doing nothing on December 29, 2000, because it is the quietest night of the year on campus. This is correct. His testimony is accurate. December 29th is literally the quietest night. I believe that Mike McQuarrie was at home watching the Peach Bowl between Georgia Tech and LSU. The game ends at 8:37 or 8:38. and that gives him the right amount of time to go from home to the Lash building because he's bored out of his mind after watching football all day. And that is when he hears what he says are slapping sounds in the shower. He peers by his later testimony through a smoky window or mirror, and for 2 or 3 seconds sees Jerry Sandusky doing something he doesn't even know what with a boy. There are 6 weeks between December 29th and February 10th. 6 weeks that Mike McQuarrie does nothing regarding a public disclosure of this. Now, when he has his conversation with his dad and Dr. Dranoff, I don't know. I don't know if it was that night. I don't know if it was later. I am open, but as I've told you, the coup de grace telling me that my theory on this is correct is that it fit with McQuarrie's testimony and Sandusky's testimony and Alan Meyer's schedule and the college roommate's recollection. It even dovetails with McQuarrie and Dr. Dranoff's own testimony. Now, this is where things get complex. We explained it in the podcast, but Dranoff and McQuarrie talk about having a meeting with Gary Schultz where they ask for a follow-up on Mike's report to Joe Paterno about Jerry Sandusky. And long and short of it is, Gary Schultz is positive that that meeting only took place between 10 days and 2 weeks after McQuarrie goes to Paterno, which, by the way, is awfully quick to be asking for an update, right? I mean, especially given the level of urgency and their I don't say urgency, but their level of concern. Like, hey, what the hell happened with that report that Mike made about Jerry Sandusky? Has there been any conclusion with that? Well, Dranoff's own testimony. Dranoff is asked by, I believe, prosecutors, and there's 2 different testimonies that he's made where he alludes to this same timeline, where how long after Mike comes to you to tell you about this did you have your meeting with Gary Schultz? And Dranoff says it was between 1 and 3 months. Mm-hmm. 1 and 3. Well, what's the mean between 1 and 3? It's 2, right? What's late February minus 2 months? It's late December. Right. And John McQuarrie is on record is saying something rather similar, where it's over a month. I forget exactly what, but it's a similar statement that McQuarrie makes between the time period of the meeting with Mike McQuarrie and the meeting with Gary Schultz. So, to me, the most plausible scenario is this. On December 29th, this episode occurs. I don't know when he goes to see his dad and Dr. Dranoff. It's possible to me, Karl, that Mike might have thought better of it over a holiday weekend, not wanting to bother Joe. Maybe this wasn't a big deal. Maybe I didn't see what I thought I did. I want to bother with this. By the way, since Mike's desperate for a job, I actually believe one of Mike's motivations here might have been that he reads that Jerry is up for the Virginia head coaching, right? Jerry is potentially a godsend for Mike McQuarrie. If Jerry gets a head coaching job, he might hire Mike because he knows Mike. They've actually had a pretty good relationship up to this point. So Mike doesn't want to do anything to jeopardize his relationship with Jerry Sandusky. So it's on it until the Kenny Jackson job opens up. Okay. Now, by the time the Jackson job opens up, Jerry ain't getting any head coaching jobs. It's too late for this year. And Mike wants a job. And it is my very strong opinion that had motivations both from an offensive as well as a defensive perspective. I can explain the defensive one if you want me to, about why he would need to go see Joe Paterno with that job open. And Mike, even in my opinion, makes up testimony, Karl. You may remember this. He makes up testimony to cover his ass on this. He claims that Joe Paterno says to him on the phone, if this is about a job, don't bother coming over. I don't have one for you. I was in the Paterno home. And I happened to, by chance, mention that piece of testimony. And Sue Paterno, this was in front of a dozen people. Sue Paterno wasn't even directly in the conversation, spins around. She's over in the kitchen getting ice cream. Peachy Paterno, probably. And she screams at me, that never happened. And she was there that day, Karl. She was there that day. So Mike is making shit up to be able to throw people off of what really transpired here. And by the way, the Kenny Jackson job blows up the entire cover-up theory, because guess what? Mike doesn't get that job in 2001. He gets it in 2004 when it opens up a second time. Now, how do you run a cover-up with the only witness not being awarded with an open job that they wanted and that they were qualified for? How does that make any fucking goddamn sense? It doesn't, because it didn't happen. There was no cover. And Mike McQueary didn't.
It's 12:30 at night. The kids might still be up. They watch the F-bombs, man. Serious side point. Yeah, no, it's okay.
Have I convinced you, Karl?
Well,
have I convinced
you? The answer is, I think it's very interesting, because I've always thought that McQueary couldn't have seen what he thought he saw, nor the fact that listen, if he told a medical doctor that he saw a kid being raped, they would have to make a CYS report, okay? And there was nothing about his father that led me to believe that he isn't very serious about his job and he wasn't sensitive to kids. The same thing with Dr. Dranoff. And McQueary changed his story so many times, but there was something else unique about him. He was very gregarious and talkative, to the point of absurdity in courtrooms, where he would just talk and talk and talk, and he would answer questions, roll between combative and flip-flopping, and gave lots of different testimony. And we know that the Attorney General got a hold of him and sat him down in a room for a couple hours on one of the first go-rounds. And I always felt like he was somebody who kind of wanted to say what he thought you wanted to hear. So if you remember with the ESPN reporter or whatever, early on, he said he saw a rape, and then the ESPN guys emailed him and said, well, you saw a rape, and what exactly did you do? And he was like, no, I didn't see a rape, right? Because he didn't want to say I saw a rape and did something, because he was kind of backing off the original story. I always felt with him that, and pieced this together in a case where you already know that the police are leading witnesses and telling them what they need to hear and denying it all along. But again, they were caught several times. So I suspect that McQueary may have not really seen anything of moment, might have, even if a fair and partial investigator had gotten to him, someone who actually just wanted to know what he remembered and what he saw, they might not have walked away with much. So I always felt like it was problematic in that area the entire time. And by the way, interestingly, that's one of the areas where the jury gave some acquittals, right? McQueary's own testimony.
Well, you won one of those acquittals thanks to your cross-examination of Mike McQueary. I mean, you know that,
which I told you, and I don't know if the public knows this. Yeah, they handed me the file folder right before and said, original plan was you're not going to be talking in court, but here, after lunch today, you're going to cross-examine the next 3 witnesses. So I did the best I could, right?
Which is what you just said there is a bombshell that in a rational world would make news. I mean, Joe Amendola, who was a celebrity at that time, and Jerry Sandusky's lead defense attorney, decided at the last second he was not going to cross-examine the primary witness in the entire case, Mike McQueary, because he told you that he had some family conflict, right? Didn't feel right about it.
He said he didn't feel comfortable because he knew them or knew the father or knew the uncle. They were, Grand Poobahs in the same elks. I don't remember the exact, but it was just very bizarre to me.
It's absurd. It's absurd. It frankly, there have been cases that have gotten new trials on far less than that, as far as
John, did you ever go back and look at my signing statement when I entered my appearance, because that judge wanted me to enter my appearance and he was all hot and trot about that. And my concern was didn't want to enter my appearance because we were not adequately prepared and they weren't letting us become adequately prepared. And the government was throwing documents by the thousands of pages at the last minute. They were the judge is denying continuances. And he said, I got to enter my appearance. So I put a signing statement on there, which is a completely made up thing in a regular court, right? I threw the signing statement on there just for historical little quirk. Presidents, when they sign bills, will put a signing statement on there. So me being the smart ass that I am, I put a signing statement on there. And I said, I'm only entering my appearance because otherwise this poor guy's not going to have the assistance of an attorney that he needs. But nonetheless, we're not prepared. My fear is we're being forced into trial without being prepared. Some of the problems in this trial can go to the competency of the counsel. Some of the problems in this trial can be racked up to the fact that the government worked this judge over really, really well to make sure that the defense wasn't prepared. And some of this can go to the judge who, for whatever reason, had it in his head that he had to complete this case to the point where he would not allow continuances. He wasn't going to have continuances. He was having secret meetings up in a hotel room at one point that I didn't know anything about until years later, involving prosecutors and other judges. So I would tell you to this day that it is my impression that judge was appointed by the Supreme Court or somebody with explicit instructions that case was to be done immediately before football season or whatever the hell it was that the exact instruction was. But I always felt like that. And in the meantime, we got a crazy grand jury judge, who's in bed with the prosecutor, writing little fluff emails back and forth about how guilty Jerry is. And I remember the first time I did a grand jury proceeding in the case, I called Amendola up because that was part of the reason I was brought in, because I had a lot of grand jury experience. I called Amendola up and I'm like, these guys are asshole buddies. This is not good. Like, they're laughing and carrying on in the session. And the judge said he'd get back to us on any exculpatory information. That grand jury judge couldn't find any exculpatory information. Now, he was removed by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court quietly after all this happened, but I don't think the public or us really know why. And I don't think we'll ever know exactly why, but I believe it's because of his mishandling of the Sandusky case.
Well, Karl, there's so many different elements of this case that the public doesn't know and the media doesn't know that are mind-blowing. But how many people would be stunned to learn that the grand jury judge in this case lost their job and the lead prosecutor lost their law license, both for actions that were directly related to the case? And this is a case about which there's no doubt about this in the public mind. It's unbelievable. But before, I know we're going to run out of time soon because it's especially late on the East Coast. But yeah, I just want to go back to McQueary. I want to go back to McQueary real quick. Okay.
Yeah. Please.
You indicated that you think that Mike was easily manipulated, and we know a lot now about Mike's situation when investigators come to him 10 years later. I cannot emphasize that enough. 10 years before Mike ever gives any sort of a statement indicating that he saw something that was highly inappropriate / illegal. And we now know, and Don Van Atta of ESPN was going to report this video where I record Van Atta about this to me. It's amazing. One of the more remarkable bombshells in the entire case, where Van Atta brags that he's going to report in ESPN, the magazine. Of course, he was later censored. That McQueary thought investigators were coming to him because he had been sending pictures of his penis to a woman, not his wife, through a Penn State phone. That's number one. Number two, he was also concerned about the fact that he had bet on Penn State football games. There's a remarkable YouTube video. I don't know if you know this, but a Penn State Rutgers game that ends with Joe Paterno almost getting in a fist fight with Rutgers coach because Rutgers was so pissed off that Penn State had run up the score at the last minute. Guess how they ran up the score, Karl? Mike McQueary threw a 40-yard touchdown pass in the last play of the game so that Penn State could cover the spread. This is a guy who bet on college football games.
Obviously, I have to say, I don't.
And Graham Spanier.
I don't know these things to be facts, so I'm going to take you at your word for purposes of our show. I mean, I'll do some research afterwards here. But if it's true, it's problematic.
Check out the YouTube video; it's amazing. It's trust me, it's true. It couldn't. I mean, even Deadspin, who was very pro McQueary, was kind of shocked by the whole thing. And ESPN did eventually report about the gambling. They did not report about the penis pictures because that would have been too damaging to McQuarrie. They also didn't report about something else that Graham Spanier knows, which he is not able to believes is the greatest source of Mike's vulnerability at that time. And I don't know if I agree. Definitely vulnerable definitely shows a lot about Mike's character. So the bottom line is had a lot to be worried when prosecutors came to him. A lot. Right.
And he's made, he likes to be helpful when he talks to people. He really does. But and what I mean by that is it's not a good thing to be helpful all the time, right? Sometimes you have to tell people, no, I don't know what you're talking about. But there is a class of witness out there that lawyers deal with. And any lawyer or police officer for that matter will have dealt with somebody like this, where you start asking them questions and they're very helpful. They'll tell you all about things. Oh, I think I lost our man. So give us a second here. I'm sure he'll pop back up on every once in a while. It's a West Coast, East Coast feed. But what I was going to say is every time we have a witness, right, they want to be helpful. They want to answer questions. So they don't feel like they should say, I didn't see it. I didn't hear about it. I don't know about it. I'm not sure about it. Instead, they answer. So sometimes you almost want to throw a question in that you know they couldn't know the answer to, or is a completely false question designed just to test a person to see if they have the information or not. And John is coming back, I'm pretty sure, here any moment now. Here he comes. All right, you're back, my friend. You're back. I don't know what happened there. What I was just talking about while you were gone was the idea that we had these witnesses that want to be helpful. They want to jump in and answer questions, but they'll answer questions about stuff they don't even know about. And I think McQuarrie was that guy, and he answered a lot of questions for a lot of people, and then woke up one day and realized that he'd given 100 inconsistent answers and was stuck with all the stupid stuff he said. But even then, he didn't stop. He just kept going. And, well, what about this? Well, no, that's not really what I said. Well, look at the grand jury. I mean, how many different views could you? I mean, I just remember the different testimonies he gave in so many different locations, and they kept changing. So I always feel like let's but not in a good way.
Well, let's also remember he made millions and millions of dollars from this case because of his own lawsuit against Penn State, which was an absurd lawsuit. The idea that somehow he was a whistleblower was absurd.
Which goes back to your theory, by the way, that these colleges fold easily. That's you go woke, you go broke. I don't know.
Yeah.
John, where can people see your podcast? And I should say, listen to your podcast. Where do we go to get that? Besides Apple and everywhere else.
Well, there's iTunes, podcast distributors. The home base is our website, which is framingpaterno.com. That's www.framingpaterno.com. I want to be clear. I unfortunately hate it. Sounds conspiratorial, and I'd add to the word. And I wish I hadn't picked that, but once it became well known, it was hard to change. I am an ardent anti-conspiracy person. I am, in fact, I'm the least conspiratorial person in this entire case. You have to be a conspiracy theorist to believe in the conventional wisdom of this case. You have to believe in a massive conspiracy to believe that Jerry Sandusky is actually innocent, because you have to believe in this massive, absurd Penn State cover-up. Which is an actual conspiracy. And I don't believe human beings.
Right. Can it be, though? And I always say this, like, it doesn't always have to start as like a spoken conspiracy, right? But once it's decided that this guy is bad, then I can't put out for him. And so a lot of the conspirators in any of these person non grata type conspiracies, they're not really like keyed in on it. They just fall into it. So, during World War I or II, you couldn't like serve sauerkraut with your traditional New Year's dinner because you were somehow supporting the Germans, right? And so you can't be someone who questions. You understand? Like if someone says, if you talk to somebody at Penn State and they think they have something helpful for Jerry or Joe, right? But they don't want to talk about it anymore because it's no longer a good thing to be on that side. That's what I mean by a kind of a conspiracy
okay. Yeah.
that
All right. Yeah, I
isn't
agree.
planned.
I agree. I agree with that.
You get stuck. Everybody then toes the line. It's sort of like the emperor has no clothes, right? He has clothes. Look, I'm not going to be the guy that says it.
No,
You're the guy that says it, right? And tell me something. What's the personal toll been for you in this arena? I mean, you've been doing this for a long time. What has it been?
It's been horrendous. This has been the worst thing that's ever happened in my public life. It should have been the best thing. I think it's been my best work, although I've made many, many, many mistakes. But I believe that I have proven beyond any shadow of a doubt, and lots of people have listened to us with hindsight agree with me, that the biggest sports story of this millennium was a fraud. It didn't happen. Now, in a rational world, that would be good for your career, right? That would be good for your life. But it's been exactly the opposite, which is keeping with this entire case. Everything is upside down. The good guys are the bad guys. The bad guys are the good guys. And, it's a miracle that I'm not divorced. I mean that pretty seriously. By the way, one of the many ways that I try to convince people just on the very eye level that this case doesn't make any sense is with the issue of divorce. Karl, I don't know that you've thought about this. I don't think we've talked about this, but let's take a look at the scorecard. Jerry Sandusky, not divorced, which is unbelievable. Grand Spanier, divorced. Gary Schultz, not divorced. Tim Curley, not divorced. John Ziegler, not divorced. Mike McQueary, divorced. Aaron Fisher, divorced. Aaron Fisher's mom, who was a key figure in this, divorced yet again. How is that possible? How is that possible when all the bad guys here? How is that possible? Karl, you know that's not possible. That's not possible. So in the real world, that's not possible.
Let me ask you this. You professionally, are you doing radio still, or are you just doing the podcast? What are you doing? What's your next project, I guess?
Oh, professionally, my career has been destroyed. I mean, I was a senior columnist at Mediaite for the last 5 or 6 years, which I left on my own because of reasons dealing with their position on COVID, which I couldn't take anymore. And
the only guy
that Liz Habib and I have been right. And so, and Liz Habib planning on starting this new podcast, which we've tentatively titled "The Death of Journalism." But I honestly don't know when that is going to start. We've had some technical issues, which hopefully we're sorting out. I'm hoping that that'll happen, but I do not know. And I don't know if that's going to be successful not because the content won't be good, just because the nature of the beast is a way, as I said at the beginning of all this, is to play to some cult or sing to some choir. And I just don't do that. I'm a square peg in a round hole. So really the only chance of reviving my career is if something happens with Jerry Sandusky. I'm kind of in the same boat as the administrators. I've tried to explain to the administrators, Spanier, Curley, and Schultz, to only some success, that their only hope at this point, much like for Joe Paterno, is if Jerry Sandusky somehow gets exonerated, which is a long shot because of the massive factors against, by the way, Jerry's own stupidity, because Jerry continues to be hesitant to go into federal court, which is the only place he would have a chance. And you've actually explained to me partially why that's happened, because you have experiences with the
listen, my audience knows I've been to jail. When you go to jail, the first thing the inmates want to do is tell you, fire your lawyers, get rid of them, talk to these guys in the law library. They're not crooked like the lawyers, and they're going to help you. Well, the guys in the law library are as crooked as or more crooked than the lawyers. What they want is you to pay them lots of commissary and money, and a lot of money flows through prisons, I assure you. And they give them this really bum advice, which is, don't listen to these guys on the street. They're only going to hurt you. They already sold you down there. Now you're in jail and you've lost, right? So you're very susceptible. Talk about a easily victimized individual is a prisoner who is innocent,
especially Jerry, who's very naive.
and so I suspect that's very difficult for him, because the other thing is those charlatans in prison have 24/7 access to you. Communication to the street is very poor. So even when there are breakthroughs with the lawyers on the street, the guys in prison, bear hug the people back into stupidity. So John, before we go, and by the way, I appreciate you doing this on short notice with me. It's an honor to have you on, first of all. I still think, after everything I've learned about you in my research, that you could still be a talk radio guy. You could still do documentaries, keep doing these podcasts, because I think you've got what it takes. I mean, that's just my humble opinion. So I want your opinion on a couple of things. They're completely unrelated to Jerry Sandusky.
Well,
you got to give me a couple of
hold
minutes.
Hold on. Can I tell you why I have yeah, sure. But let me just explain why you just said it's not accurate. We live in a world where substance matters. I am the most easily torpedoed candidate for any job of any sort in the world. I am known as Jerry Sandusky's most public defender. Game, set, match right there. And within conservative circles, I also happen to be anti-Donald Trump. So if Sandusky wasn't already 3 strikes against me, Donald Trump is another 3 strikes against me. So
John, we have that in common.
Completely.
I was Jerry Sandusky's lawyer, and I was Jerry Sandusky's lawyer, so I get some flack for that. You're his more vocal supporter these days. I also argue with my guys about Trump all the time, because I say it this way: I would have voted for Trump the first time only because of the 2 choices, somewhat reluctantly. I definitely wouldn't have voted for Trump the second time. I was incarcerated for the entire Trump presidency, so I like to say, I don't really have to worry about it. Yeah, right. But to me, he's the test of whether somebody's truly a conservative or not, because if you think Trump's a conservative, then you probably aren't a conservative. But I can't convince anybody of that, right? I get yelled at about that all the time. I'm like, you guys don't. What happened to free trade? What happened to? And they're like, no, you don't understand. I'm like, no, I understand. And when you tell me one man, no American, no conservative American should ever say one man, right? It's we the people. I'm not going to say it's a fascist bent, but it's certainly a weird bent, a populist bent of some sort. So what do you think about Biden? What's going on with him? What do you think about Uncle Joe?
Well, I think he's very different than the old Joe Biden, that's for sure. He's woke Joe Biden when he's not asleep.
Right.
I think he's made many mistakes. He's much worse than I had hoped for, not just in results, but also in his philosophy. The loan forgiveness, college loan forgiveness, is completely absurd. I think, unfortunately, Democrats are going to survive the midterms, largely because of Trump's influence, and going to get wiped out like they should. And that's going to be devastating, because to me, that means that there'll be no punishment for COVID, and it means we'll have another COVID eventually again when the opportunity arises. And
it's funny. It's funny you mentioned Biden being woke, because a lot of people don't really realize that he and Elizabeth Warren, for instance, used to be at loggerheads with each other, right? I mean, he's the guy that took the bankruptcy out of bankruptcy law on behalf of the banks. So the new Joe Biden is definitely a way different cat. What about Putin? What do you think is going to happen with Russia?
I don't consider myself a Russian expert. I've not been that interested in the war in Ukraine. I'm a Reagan Republican, so I'm inherently suspicious of Russia. I'm not a Trump Republican who somehow embraces Putin and Russia. But I'm I don't usually give opinions on things that I don't have a strong base of knowledge on. So I really don't have a great
Okay.
strong
That's a
opinion
valid
on Russia,
answer.
other than I'm anti Putin. You know.
Okay. And talking about the whole woke thing, because you made the reference, and I actually had written down woke because I wanted to know, where do you think this whole woke thing goes? Are we going to be, there's a meme going around about putting like litter boxes in schools because some kids identify as, pets or something like this, which I thought was kind of funny. But do you think this wokeism is the future of America, and I guess maybe if the Democrats don't get punished in this election, then the signal is it's okay.
Yeah, I think that need to be punished. If not, which I don't think they will be as much should be or could be, then there'll be no punishment for COVID, no punishment for the wokeness, and that means we'll get more wokeness, because what we've seen over the last couple of years is liberals really letting their freak flag fly in a way that they've never felt comfortable before doing. I mean, I'll give you an example, Carl. I live north of Los Angeles, in not anywhere shape or form a red county, but not a blue county, like a purplish county, right? Mm-hmm. And in my wife's middle school, she was shocked to find in the boys' bathroom they are required to have pads and tampons in the boys' bathroom. And I later learned this is a state law in California. What? So imagine the millions of dollars being spent so that boys can take these tampons and turn them into paper airplanes, so that somehow the wokeness factor can be hit properly. I mean, it's bizarre. This is just one of
bizarre.
Many examples. I mean, I never imagined that I would have a 10-year-old who knows about sex, but actually knows a lot about LBG issues.
Right.
And in Disneyland, where we used to go all the time, we don't go anymore because they won't even say ladies and gentlemen. And they're doing all sorts of other woke things. So I'm a big believer that the rest of the country will be like California if they're not vigilant. And I think Pennsylvania is kind of an interesting example of that, because Pennsylvania, I grew up there and I can't figure out Pennsylvania politically at all. When you look at the results of the last few years, how do you get voting twice team, but having Wolf as your governor for two elections, and it looks like you're going to replace him with another woke liberal as your governor.
Listen, my problem is I voted for
Republican.
I voted for a great Republican for governor, right? But he didn't win the primary. And my friends here in Pennsylvania, my Republican friends, I vote Republican. My Republican friends picked a guy who, for his War College faculty photo, picked to dress up in a Confederate uniform. And what's funny in the photo is everybody's here, and then he's off on the side, like a little bit by himself, because you knew every one of those guys there was like, I'm not getting in the picture with the guy with the Confederate uniform on. He's got an oath keeper as his personal security, and he's a friend with the guy that runs Gab and gave him money, and there's some question on the anti-Semite thing. But you couldn't pick a guy that's less electable to a main. Oh, and by the way, he's against abortion to the point where he doesn't support exceptions for the life of the mother. He sort of stopped articulating that now, given what's gone on, but he was pretty proud to say that before. You can't win in Pennsylvania with a Republican like that. I always said Tom Ridge was a pro-choice Republican and Casey was a pro-life Democrat, right? Because what's the lesson in Pennsylvania? If you want to win statewide office, you have to be, like you said, you can't quite figure it out, but you have to be somewhere in that center range.
But how did Trump beat Hillary, who, by the way, had ties to the state? Her father was a Penn State quarterback, for God's sake. How did Trump beat Hillary in 2016 in Pennsylvania? And you guys, after COVID, gonna elect all these liberal Democrats?
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
completely baffled. I don't get
it. I can go back to the Trump factor. Trump came in and wanted Oz. Trump came in and wanted Mastriano for governor, and he pushed both of them over the top.
Trump, but how does the same electorate that voted for Trump over Hillary vote?
Oh well,
what looks like to be pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, because our guys who voted for Trump, a lot of our Democrats and middle of the road guys who voted for Trump didn't really become Republicans. That's like a fallacy, I think, that some people in the state had, that Trump brought all these new people to the Republican Party. Trump brought populism out, and there was a lot of people who voted for Trump, I think, because they just didn't like the usual suspects, and Hillary was one of the usual suspects. So I feel like Trump got enough of that stick it to the man vote. Let's put this business guy in, successful or unsuccessful. I think that's what it was. I'm not, I love Trump as a marketer. I love Trump as a guy who certainly is an entertainer. I think he's a terrible freaking president. And this pile of classified documents mixed in with old scrapbooks in his basement somewhere. I mean, what if anybody else had done that? I don't care, Republican or Democrat. Everybody who says it's no big deal their minds would be exploding right now, and they'd want to hang the guy and send him to Guantanamo Bay for those imaginary bargains my QAnon friends keep talking about. But I don't know. I digress. But I wanted.
I agree with that. By the way,
go ahead, John.
No, but I agree with most of that. But by the way, to bring this full circle, it feels like we're ending it up, which is fine. You might be surprised to know that many of the Jerry Sandusky accusers from the trial are Trump fans. I don't know if that's because they now have a lot of money but we keep a pretty close eye on their social media feeds, which are quite interesting. They're all big Penn State fans and they're Trump fans, which is, I think, very telling.
So John, one last question. You apparently were a very good golfer at one time. How is your golf game these days?
Well, it's better, not quite where I hoped it would be. I'm a solid one handicapper. I played in 5 different USGA qualifiers this year. Unfortunately, I did not qualify for any, but I played pretty well in all of them. I was leading our U.S. amateur qualifier through 7 holes. I was 3 under par before I had a blunder. And then ended up
your blunder is probably what
your
blunder is like a boat. Your version of a blunder is like an occasional bogey, right?
I made a 6 on a very difficult my blunder there. But I was never going to qualify for the U.S. Amateur in all likelihood. I'm 55 years old now. I was mostly playing that to try to prepare myself for other qualifiers. I hope there's still a few more tournaments left in the year that I hope to play. I actually think the Sandusky case harmed you said what was the ramifications? And I think one of the many ramifications is it hurt my golf game. Not because I wasn't playing. I have plenty of time because I'm basically unemployed. It's just it shot my nerves. I mean, it really did. It screwed with my head and my whole outlook on life. I don't know if that's necessarily.
I'm going to tell you something, John. It's 100% true, and I'm going to tell you why. I had a big thing going on. Stole a lot of money. Had a gambling addiction. Turned myself in. After I turned myself in, and before I went to jail, I shot some of the best golf of my life. And it sounds crazy, okay? But it's because it was over. I know I'm going to jail, okay? I know that part, right? But I'm no longer living this secret lie. I'm no longer trying to figure out, like how to move money to make sure the business, you know what I'm saying? Like all the stress of running a criminal enterprise and a gambling addiction are gone. And now now I no longer have that. And I'm at peace, as a sort of an inner peace. Okay. And I felt that.
That's very interesting.
Now I'm a 14 handicap, or sometimes I get down to 12. I've been off for 5 years now. I was 12 when I went in. I popped back up to 14, but I'll get it down a little more than that. I'm just having a little drive problem right now. But
I will say I've spent an inordinate amount of time on the driving range thinking about Mike McQuarrie over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
I would say, in all seriousness, I would say that many of my theories and eureka moments came on the driving range, which sounds bizarre, but it's true.
No, that's sometimes that's the meditative, but no, really, and I think there's some truth to that. And I say that not jokingly, but in all truthfulness. And I joke now that I play. It removed a level of stress, but then if all life creeps up on you, and so I do think that golf is a mental game. But I wanted to ask you about that because I picked up when I was looking into a little bit about you that apparently you're a golfer of note, and the one handicap is obviously damn good. People who don't know the game, John's a very good golfer. Don't let him fool you. All right. I'm going to wrap it up, boss. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I want to thank everybody for listening. You guys need to check out what is With the Benefit of Hindsight. And you can get that. What's the website again there?
Framingpaterno.com and the podcast With the Benefit of Hindsight can be found on iTunes, Spotify, and all their major podcasts.
I'm going to throw links up on all these feeds and all the permanent links to this, to With the Benefit of Hindsight. So, I'm hoping that as people listen to this, they'll come to it with an open mind. You've obviously given a lot of yourself to this. So, John, keep up the good work and keep up the good fight. And you and I will talk again. I'm gonna want to get you back, but I'll also talk to you off the air because we have a few
100%. And when appropriate, we're gonna have you. Maybe we'll do episode 20 of With the Benefit of Hindsight with Karl Rominger. So that'll be fun.
All right. Thank you, my friend. Have a great night.